The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, delivered with the kind of official weight that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. Margaret Chun, 43, a maritime attorney specializing in waterfront property rights, stood on her century-old ferry dock watching the sunrise over Puget Sound as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a cease and desist order from the Harborview HOA, demanding she remove her unauthorized structure within 14 days or face daily fines of $750. Margaret had inherited this dock from her grandfather 30 years ago, a retired ferry captain who purchased the underwater land rights in 1952. She had the original deed, the survey maps, the county records going back 73 years. And now some HOA president who'd moved into the development 2 years ago was claiming Margaret was trespassing on community property. But what this Karen didn't know was that Margaret had spent 2 decades defending waterfront property owners against exactly this kind of overreach. Today, everything was about to change. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story of justice served, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of karma and revenge. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where justice was finally served in the most satisfying way imaginable. The first part takes us through Margaret's emotional journey as she watched her family legacy come under attack by someone who fundamentally misunderstood property law. For 3 months, she endured increasingly aggressive demands from an HOA president named Patricia Donovan, who seemed convinced that all waterfront access belonged to the homeowners association she'd recently taken control of. Margaret tried every reasonable avenue, first polite explanations backed by documentation, meetings with the HOA board where she presented her grandfather's original purchase documents, even offers to share access with the community despite having zero legal obligation to do so. Each attempt was met with dismissal, condescension, and threats. The breaking point came when Patricia physically blocked Margaret's boat from docking, surrounded by other HOA members with cameras, treating Margaret like a criminal on her own property. That night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She stopped trying to be nice and started preparing for war. The confrontation unfolded with the precision of a legal brief. Margaret had spent weeks not just gathering her own ironclad documentation, but investigating exactly what the HOA actually owned, what Patricia's authority actually extended to, and where the vulnerabilities in their position lay. When she finally called an emergency HOA meeting, Patricia arrived expecting to publicly humiliate Margaret into submission. Instead, Margaret revealed evidence that made the entire room go silent, exposed lies Patricia had told the board, and presented an ultimatum that left the HOA president with absolutely no way out. The resolution brought consequences that rippled through the entire community in ways no one expected. Here's exactly how it happened. Margaret Chun had grown up on that dock. Her earliest memories were of her grandfather's weathered hands teaching her to tie a bowline knot, the smell of creosote and salt air, the rhythmic slap of waves against the pilings. Thomas Chun had been a Puget Sound ferry captain for 38 years, and when he retired in 1952, he'd done something unusual for that era. He purchased not just waterfront property, but the underwater land rights extending 200 feet into the Sound, along with a perpetual easement for dock access. Back then, the area was mostly fishing cabins and working waterfront. The carefully worded deed cost him $3,000, a fortune on a ferry captain's pension. But Thomas Chun understood something about the Pacific Northwest. Waterfront access was going to become precious. Margaret inherited the property in 1995 when she was 13, after her grandfather passed away from a heart attack while mending crab pots on that same dock. Her parents had kept it maintained through her teenage years, and when Margaret finished law school at the University of Washington, she'd specialized in maritime and property law, partly because of that inheritance. She knew every square inch of those underwater land rights. She'd reviewed the surveys, updated the title insurance, paid property taxes on the submerged lands for 3 decades. At 43, she was a partner at a Seattle firm that has successfully defended waterfront property owners in 18 separate cases against developers, municipalities, and yes, overreaching homeowners associations. She lived in a modest craftsman house 3 blocks from the water. Walk into her dock every morning at 5:30 to kayak before work. The routine kept her sane through 60-hour work weeks and a divorce 2 years earlier that had left her grateful for spaces that were entirely, legally, unquestionably hers. The trouble started in June when Patricia Donovan was elected president of the Harborview Homeowners Association. The development had gone up in 2018, 72 townhomes built on what used to be an old cannery lot. Margaret had watched the construction with mild interest, noting that the developer's waterfront access was limited to a small community beach area about 300 yards south of her dock. The original HOA board had been reasonable people who understood property boundaries. Patricia Donovan was not reasonable people. The first incident happened on June 15th. Margaret returned from her morning kayak to find a laminated sign zip-tied to her dock railing. Private property, Harborview HOA residents, only violators will be prosecuted. She'd stared at it for a full minute, then pulled out her phone and photographed it from 4 angles before removing it. Later that day, she sent a polite email to the HOA board explaining that this was her private dock on her private underwater land rights, attaching a copy of her deed and survey map. Patricia's response came within an hour. Your dock extends into community waters. Remove your kayak and unauthorized structure or we'll take legal action. The second incident escalated 3 weeks later. Margaret arrived at her dock at dawn to find 2 HOA members she didn't recognize setting up beach chairs on her dock, along with a small folding table and a cooler. When she politely asked them to leave, they'd laughed. Patricia said we can use any dock in the community, one of them told her, cracking open a beer at 6 in the morning. She said you've been hogging it long enough. Margaret had pulled out her phone and started recording. This is private property. I'm asking you to leave. They'd mocked her, made jokes about lawyers thinking they owned everything, and only left when she threatened to call the sheriff. The encounter left her shaking with frustration. By July, Patricia had organized 3 separate community meetings where she presented maps that conveniently showed Margaret's dock as part of HOA property. Margaret attended one, bringing her survey maps and deed. Patricia had dismissed her documents as old paperwork that doesn't reflect current boundaries, which made about as much legal sense as claiming the moon belonged to your homeowners association. The other board members seemed uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge Patricia's authority. Margaret left that meeting realizing the HOA president wasn't just mistaken. She was deliberately misrepresenting property boundaries to expand HOA control. Then came the certified letter in September, followed by Patricia physically blocking her boat 3 days later, surrounded by a dozen HOA members with smartphones recording, as if Margaret were some kind of criminal. Patricia had stood on Margaret's dock with her arms crossed and said loudly, "You're trespassing on community property, and we have it all on camera." The humiliation, the injustice of being treated like a thief on her own family's property, crystallized into something cold and sharp in Margaret's chest. That night, she opened her laptop and began researching not just her own property rights, but every single detail of the Harborview HOA's legal standing, Patricia Donovan's background, and exactly how much rope she could give them before they hanged themselves. If Patricia wanted a legal fight, Margaret would show her what it meant to go up against someone who'd spent 20 years winning these battles professionally. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, October 7th, in the Harborview Community Center. Margaret had called it herself, using a provision in the HOA bylaws that allowed any affected property owner to request a hearing before the board. Patricia had tried to refuse, claiming Margaret wasn't a member of the HOA, which was true. But Margaret had politely cited the Washington State Homeowners Association Act, which required HOAs to hear disputes from adjacent property owners when the dispute involved boundary claims. Patricia had agreed to the meeting with obvious irritation, sending an email that said, "Fine, come present your case. The board will rule against you, and then you'll have no choice but to comply." Margaret arrived at 6:55, 10 minutes early. The community center was a bland room with folding chairs and a long table at the front where the 5-member HOA board sat. Patricia occupied the center seat, flanked by 4 other board members who looked uncomfortable. About 30 HOA residents filled the chairs, most of them looking curious about the drama. Patricia had clearly spread her version of events because several people glared at Margaret. As she walked in carrying a leather document case, Patricia started the meeting with her typical confidence. "We're here because Miss Chun refuses to acknowledge that her dock structure is on HOA property and must be removed. I've tried to resolve this amicably, but she's been unwilling to cooperate." She gestured to a foam board displaying a map that supposedly showed property boundaries. "As you can see, her dock extends into our waterfront access area." Margaret waited patiently while Patricia spoke, noting how the HOA president carefully avoided mentioning underwater land rights or the specific legal basis for her claims. When Patricia finished, Margaret stood and placed her document case on the empty chair beside her. "Thank you for that introduction, Patricia. I'd like to address several points, starting with the most fundamental issue. You don't actually know what property the HOA owns." The room went quiet. Patricia's smile tightened. "Excuse me?" Margaret opened her document case and pulled out the first set of documents. "I have here the original 1952 deed showing my grandfather Thomas Chun's purchase of Lot 47, including underwater land rights extending 200 feet into Puget Sound. Recorded with King County, parcel number 0-3-8-9-5-7-2. I have the survey map completed in 1953 by Holbrook Engineering, showing exact boundaries. I have every subsequent title transfer, including the inheritance transfer to me in 1995. I have 30 years of property tax payments on both the surface land and the submerged land rights." She placed each document on the table in front of the board, watching their faces shift from skepticism to uncertainty. "More importantly," Margaret continued, her voice calm and measured, "I have the Harborview Development's title report from 2017, which I obtained from county records. Would you like to know what it says about waterfront access?" She didn't wait for an answer. "It explicitly excludes parcel 0-3-8-9-5-7-2 and notes that adjacent, private underwater land rights exist to the north of the development. The developer knew exactly where your property ended and mine began. They included it in your HOA's governing documents." She pulled out another document, this one newer. "This is your HOA as Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, filed in 2018. Page 17, Section 4, subsection C clearly states that the HOA's waterfront access is limited to the designated community beach area. Parcel 0-3-8-9-6-1-5, and specifically acknowledges adjacent private property rights." Margaret looked directly at Patricia. "Did you read your own governing documents before claiming my dock belonged to the HOA?" Patricia's face had gone pale, but she recovered quickly. "Those documents are complicated, and boundaries on water are different than land boundaries. We have a right to access." "No," Margaret interrupted, her attorney voice cutting through the attempted deflection. "You don't. Washington state law is crystal clear on underwater land rights. When my grandfather purchased those rights in 1952, they became private property, no different than the land your townhomes sit on. You have no more right to use my dock than I have to walk into your living room and set up a beach chair." She pulled out her phone and brought up a folder of photographs. "Now let's discuss your behavior over the past 4 months. I have documentation of every incident." She turned to the board members, deliberately bypassing Patricia. "On June 15th, your president placed unauthorized signage on my property. On July 7th, she encouraged HOA members to trespass on my dock. On August 23rd, she held a community meeting where she presented false information about property boundaries to convince residents they had rights to my property. And on September 10th, she physically blocked my boat from accessing my own dock while other members recorded the incident, attempting to create the appearance that I was in the wrong. Margaret placed printed screenshots on the table showing social media posts from Patricia's Facebook page. These are posts from Patricia over the past 3 months. In this one from July, she tells the community group, "We're taking back our waterfront from someone who thinks old paperwork gives her special rights." In this one from August, she says, "Sometimes you have to stand up to entitled people who think they're above community rules." And in this one from last week, she promises the HOA board she'll have my dock removed by November 1st, quote, "one way or another." The room was dead silent now. One of the other board members, a woman in her 60s named Susan, spoke up nervously. "Patricia, did you actually verify the property boundaries before taking these actions?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "I consulted with people, and everyone agreed." "Did you consult with a surveyor?" Margaret asked. "A real estate attorney?" "Did. You reviewed the actual title documents I sent you in June?" She already knew the answer from Patricia's expression. "Because if you had, you would have known that every single action you've taken over the past 4 months constitutes either trespass or harassment of a private property owner, actions that expose the HOA to significant liability." She let that sink in before continuing. "Here's what happens next. You have 2 options. Option 1, the HOA issues a formal written apology, acknowledging that my dock is on private property, removes all false claims from HOA communications and records, and Patricia Donovan resigns as HOA president effective immediately for gross negligence and misrepresentation. Option 2, I file a civil suit against both Patricia personally and the HOA for harassment, trespass, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I'll seek compensatory damages for the time I've spent dealing with this punitive, damages for the deliberate nature of the harassment, and a permanent injunction preventing any HOA member from setting foot on my property. I'll also file a complaint with the Washington State Attorney General's office regarding HOA governance violations. My damages estimate, conservatively, is $75,000 plus attorney fees." Patricia found her voice, though it shook slightly. "You can't force me to resign." "The board would have to vote. The board absolutely can vote you out for cause," Margaret said. "And trust me, after tonight, they will. Because if they don't, and this goes to court, every single board member becomes personally liable for allowing this harassment to continue after being fully informed of the facts." She turned to face the other board members directly. "I don't want your money. I don't want a legal battle. I want what I've always wanted, to be left alone on my family's property. Patricia's ego and refusal to admit she was wrong has created this situation. You can end it tonight by doing the right thing, or you can spend the next 2 years in expensive litigation that you will absolutely lose. Your choice, but you have 48 hours to decide." Margaret gathered her documents, placed them back, in her case, and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving behind a stunned silence and the sound of Patricia Donovan's political career imploding. The email arrived at 9:30 Friday morning, less than 15 hours after the confrontation. It came from Susan Watkins, the HOA board vice president, and it was brief and professional. "The Harborview HOA board has voted 4-1 to accept your terms. Patricia Donovan submitted her resignation last night. We will draft a formal acknowledgement and apology by Monday. Please accept our sincere apologies for this situation." Margaret read it twice, sitting at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, feeling the knot in her shoulders that had been there for 4 months. Finally began to release. The formal apology arrived the following Wednesday, signed by all 4 remaining board members. It acknowledged that Margaret Chin owned private underwater land rights to parcel 0-3-8-9-5-7-2, that her dock was legally constructed on her private property, and that the HOA had no claim to any portion of her property. It stated that all previous communications claiming otherwise were issued in error due to inadequate research by former leadership. It promised that the correct property boundaries will be included in all future HOA documents and that members would be explicitly informed that Margaret's dock was private property where trespassing was prohibited. The letter was professionally written, clearly drafted by an attorney, and completely vindicated everything Margaret had said. But the story didn't end with a simple apology. The fallout rippled through the Harborview community in ways that surprised even Margaret. Within a week, 3 separate HOA members came to her house to apologize personally for participating in the dock occupation incidents. One of them, a man in his 50s named Robert, brought a bottle of wine and admitted he'd felt uncomfortable with Patricia's tactics, but hadn't wanted to cause waves. "I should have looked at your documents when you offered to show them," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed. Patricia was so confident, and none of us thought to question her. Margaret accepted the apologies graciously, appreciating that these neighbors had the courage to admit they'd been wrong. Patricia, Donovan's outcome was more severe than Margaret had anticipated. 2 weeks after her resignation, Margaret learned through community gossip that Patricia's husband worked as a project manager for a commercial real estate development firm. His company had been sued twice in the past 5 years for construction that encroached on adjacent properties. And when word got out that his wife had been forced to resign from an HOA presidency over a property boundary dispute she'd badly mishandled, his employer had quietly reassigned him to a different department with no client contact. Patricia and her family listed their townhome for sale in early November and moved out before Christmas. Margaret felt no particular satisfaction in this. She'd never wanted to ruin anyone's life, just to protect what was rightfully hers. The new HOA president, Susan Watkins, turned out to be what Patricia should have been from the start. In December, Susan knocked on Margaret's door and asked if they could talk. Over coffee, she explained that the board was implementing new procedures for any property boundary questions that would require professional surveyor verification before any action was taken. She also asked, tentatively, if Margaret would be willing to present a short educational session to the HOA about waterfront property rights, not specific to her situation, but just general information that might help residents understand these issues. Margaret agreed, and the January meeting where she presented was surprisingly well attended and appreciative. One unexpected consequence emerged in late January. A neighbor 3 houses down from the Harborview development, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, reached out to Margaret after hearing about the situation. He'd been fighting with the same HOA over a boat launch easement he'd held since 1978 that Patricia had also tried to claim belonged to the community. With Margaret's case as precedent and her professional advice, Frank was able to resolve his dispute in 2 weeks without litigation. He sent her a thank you card with a photo of his boat, properly launched, with the caption, "Justice Afloat." 3 months after the confrontation, Margaret stood on her dock at sunrise, the same place where this whole nightmare had begun. It was mid-January, and the morning air was sharp and cold, but the sky was clear, revealing Mount Rainier in perfect silhouette across the Sound. She'd been out kayaking, and her muscles were pleasantly tired. The dock beneath her feet was exactly as it had always been, weathered and solid, the same pilings her grandfather had driven into the seabed 70 years ago. No HOA signs. No trespassers. No harassment. Just peace. A pair of seals surfaced near the dock, their dark heads bobbing in the gentle waves. Margaret watched them for a moment, thinking about her grandfather. Thomas Chun had paid $3,000 in 1952 for these underwater land rights because he understood something fundamental. Ownership isn't about the size of your property, but about the clarity of your rights to it. He taught her to read tide tables, to respect the water, to tie knots that would hold under stress. He'd also taught her, without ever saying it directly, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand your ground. When you know you're right, Margaret had learned over the past 4 months that most people don't actually want conflict. They just want someone to stand up to the people who create it. Patricia Donovan had created conflict through arrogance and laziness, through a fundamental unwillingness to do the basic research required before making bold claims. The HOA members who followed her lead had done so not out of malice, but out of misplaced trust. And when presented with clear facts and clear consequences, reasonable people chose the reasonable path. She pulled out her phone and texted her law partner, Morrison case resolved. Client happy. See you Monday. Then she put the phone away and just stood there for a while, feeling the dock sway gently beneath her feet, listening to the water, watching the sunrise paint everything in shades of gold and silver. This was her grandfather's legacy, preserved not through violence or anger, but through patience, documentation, and the simple stubborn refusal to surrender what was rightfully hers. Justice, Margaret had learned, doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from being so thoroughly prepared that your opponents realize they never had a case to begin with. And as she stood there in the quiet morning, surrounded by water and light and the memory of hands that taught her to tie unbreakable knots, she smiled with the kind of satisfaction that can only come from knowing you did everything exactly right. Even when doing it the hard way, across the country in Asheville, North Carolina, 47-year-old Daniel Price, a retired Army Corps of Engineers hydrologist, was trimming the hedges along his property line when his neighbor, entitled real estate agent Brenda Mitchell, marched over with a measuring tape and informed him that his fence was 6 inches over the property line onto her land, demanding he move it immediately or she'd sue for encroachment. Brenda had just closed a major commercial development deal and was feeling particularly confident about property boundaries. What she didn't know was that Daniel hadn't just surveyed dams and waterways for the military. He'd also served as an expert witness in 17 property dispute cases and had personally conducted the original boundary survey for their entire neighborhood back in 2003. When she threatened legal action, Daniel smiled calmly and said, "Please do. I'd love to show a judge the survey records proving your house is actually 8 inches over the line onto my property." Brenda's confident expression crumbled. But that's a story for another time.